My name is Frith. I'm a graduate student at Dalhousie University, and I do my research in Dr. Sarah Fortune's lab. Today I'll be presenting my ongoing research on estimating field metabolic rates in North Atlantic right whales, which is part of my overarching interest in right whale energetics in a changing environment. I'll ask that the content in this presentation is not shared on social media. I'm going to talk a lot about metabolic rate, so let's start with a quick definition. Metabolic rate is the rate at which oxygen stores in the lungs, tissue, and blood are used up, and this rate increases the harder an animal works. We care about metabolic rates because they can help us understand the energetic costs of different activities. A whale that spends its day logging at the surface will use much less energy than a whale that's engaged in a more active behavior, like this whale here that's breaching. Knowing the energetic costs associated with daily activities and comparing that to energetic inputs can help inform an animal's capacity to withstand stress or to adapt to changing environments. Metabolic rate in animals is typically assessed in a controlled respiratory chamber where the change in entering and exiting oxygen concentrations can be precisely measured. The problem with large free-swimming whales like right whales is that it's impossible to capture them and stick them in a tank. There's also a lot of uncertainty in trying to estimate metabolic rate using existing equations for terrestrial mammals that describe the relationship between body mass and metabolic rate, since there are many physiological differences in aquatic mammals. One way that metabolic rate can be estimated for free-ranging large whales is through field metabolic rates, which represent an average cost of living by accounting for activity-specific expenditure at a given time. So they take into account activities like foraging, movement, and social interactions rather than just the basic amount of energy required to maintain vital organ function in a resting state. Attempted to use respiration rates to assess field metabolic rates. The basis of this method comes from the positive relationship between metabolic rate, oxygen consumption, and respiration rate. To put that in perspective, you might consider that an animal engaged in foraging activity would have elevated oxygen uptake requirements compared to a resting animal. Field metabolic rates can therefore be estimated using respiration rate, tidal volume, which is the volume of air inhaled and exhaled with each breath, oxygen extraction, which is the percentage of that oxygen that enters the blood, and the caloric equivalent of liters of oxygen that are consumed. This method is appealing because it's relatively simple to quantify respiration rates, but it does rely on some key assumptions about tidal volume and oxygen extraction, which are difficult parameters to measure. There's work being done to improve those estimates, but the focus of today's talk is on respiration rates. Seasons in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, July 2023 and 2024. We tagged a total of 23 right whales using suction cup CATS tags that continuously recorded detailed accelerometry, time depth, GPS, passive acoustic, and video data. In 2023, the tags were deployed in the traditional style alongside NOAA and Canadian Whale Institute using a carbon fiber pole, and in 2024 we teamed up with Ocean Alliance to deploy the tags from the drone. Here's a fun little video of the drone tagging. This method of tagging was very successful. We had surprisingly long tag attachment times. We had an average attachment time of 11 hours, and 4 of our tags stayed on for longer than 20 hours, with one record-breaking 38-hour attachment. This is really exciting because with this data, we're able to examine how right whales budget their time and activity over the span of 24 hours, which is hugely helpful for estimating energy inputs and outputs. Here's an example of the kind of video footage that's captured by our CATS tags. So in this case, the tag was placed behind the whale's nares with the camera facing forward. And from this footage, I'm able to count respiration events using a behavioral analysis software. This is what a dive profile looks like from the time depth recorder on the CATS tags. So depth is on the y-axis, time is on the x, and what we're looking at is 3 foraging dive cycles where the whale takes a series of breaths at the surface, dives straight down to 45 meters to feed before returning to breathe. Through video analysis of respirations, I determined that each of these peaks within a surface interval corresponds to a breath, which makes it pretty easy to quantify respirations throughout a tag deployment. Now I'm going to walk you through a time depth plot from our 38-hour tag attachment on an 8-year-old whale named Sebastian. Quick thanks to the folks at New England Aquarium for their identification of the whales we tagged. So the tag goes on around 11:30 a.m. and Sebastian fed at a depth of 45 meters for the next 8 hours. Then in orange, we see him going on a series of shallow dives interspersed with deep exploratory dives from around 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. And it's not abundantly clear what he's doing in this time frame, but we do know from co-located particle abundance data that during this time the prey layer underwent diel vertical migration from 40 meters to 20 meters. And once that shallow prey layer stabilizes, Sebastian feeds through the night at around 20 meters, and then he goes right back into deep foraging dives in the morning for about 15 hours straight. Feeding is interrupted by a brief 30-minute period where he's hanging out at the surface. We thought maybe he was resting, but from the inertial sensing data, we know he's fluking quite a bit in that time. And then he continues foraging around 70 meters until the tag dies at hour 38. The prey layer at 70 meters, we believe, did not undergo DBM. We believe it consisted of dive-pausing copepods. That was a lot to get through, but the main takeaways from going through these TDR plots are that right whales spend most of their time feeding in the Gulf in July, and that their behavior is heavily influenced by the location and the formation of the prey layer. To date, I've counted over 7,000 breaths using video and TDR data from 11 of our 23 tagged whales. My initial plan was to determine respiration rates for different behaviors, but our tagged whales spent almost all of their time foraging. We observed that right whales can spend up to 96% of their time over a 24-hour period foraging. And so focusing on respiration rates for foraging behavior alone can give a good estimate of field metabolic rates over the course of a day. Respiration rate when foraging is remarkably consistent over time for different ages, sexes, and dive depths, working out to be about 1 breath per minute across each surface interval and its succeeding dive period. The consistency in these respiration rates likely indicates that whether a whale is foraging at 20 meters or at 70 meters, which we saw in the Gulf, they're well within their aerobic capacity. And this agrees with previous studies looking at right whale foraging dives in the Bay of Fundy, where average dive depths of 120 meters were also considered to be within their aerobic capacity. While the average respiration rate across a surface interval and its succeeding dive is consistent at various depths, there are some differences in dive metrics if a whale is foraging above or below 20 meters. So this plot on the left shows deeper daytime feeding dives, and on the right we see shallower night feeding dives. Deeper dives have longer surface intervals, so about 2.5 minutes compared to 1 minute. They have higher breathing frequencies, so 1 breath every 15 seconds compared to every 35 seconds. And they have longer foraging underwater periods, so 7.5 minutes compared to 1.5 minutes. And this makes sense, assuming the whale is trying to minimize surface recovery time and maximize foraging time at depth for deeper dives. So getting to the point, I calculated field metabolic rate estimates for right whales foraging in the Gulf of St. Lawrence using respiration rates during foraging activity, which I determined through video analysis and dive profiles. Juvenile whales burn an average of 1,800 megajoules per day, and adults burn an average of 3,000. These estimates fall within the confidence intervals of previous energy estimates for right whales that use different modeling approaches. The values I used for tidal volume and oxygen extraction came from captive gray whale calves, which is the closest species to right whales that we have these estimates for. We're working toward developing new methods for field estimations of these parameters, so these values may be updated in the coming months. My next steps are to finish quantifying respiration rates for the remaining whales in my dataset, and then I'll focus more closely on respiration rates during non-foraging activities. Once that's finished and I have my final estimates for daily energy expenditure, I'll begin to process the co-located prey samples that we collected in the fluke prints of these tagged foraging whales with the goal of comparing daily energetic inputs and outputs. And this will hopefully tell us whether right whales are able to meet or exceed their energetic requirements when foraging in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. That should improve our understanding of the suitability of this habitat and the capacity for right whales to adapt to future changes in their environment. Thanks for listening. Feel free to shoot me an email at the address listed on this slide if you have any questions or you'd like to discuss this further.